So our mission here, as you can see, is to serve as a national leader in the effort to eliminate relationship and sexual violence among US college students. We intend to use a power conscious intersectional framework to bridge the gap between research and practice by bringing together expertise of researchers, prevention educators, and students to execute a comprehensive research agenda focused on the prevention of relationship and sexual violence. It's also important to note that we intend to intentionally focus on students from historically minoritized communities, recognizing that many times students in these communities are left out of the conversations about relationship and sexual violence. So it's not exclusively focusing on students with minoritized identities, but definitely intentionally focusing on students of color, queer and trans students, and students with disability. In addition to that, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we mean by primary prevention. People use this in lots of different ways. For us, what we mean is it's addressing RSV is relationship and sexual violence. It's about addressing relationship and sexual violence at the root of the problem, or at the root to stop it from happening in the first place. And the ways that we intend to focus in on that is by focusing in on perpetration and potential perpetration and peer culture. So we get a lot of questions about how in the world are you going to reach perpetrators? And the reality is reaching perpetrators is another form of response because it's already happened. But it is also a form of prevention because we intend to stop it from happening again. And we also want to reach out to people who are at high risk for perpetrating. I've been reading some interesting literature recently about some researchers or some people are advocating that we focus on every group as a high risk group because we can't separate out who the high risk people are. And so I just think that's an interesting piece to consider. The other thing we want to talk about today, so another question we get a lot is, well, shouldn't we be doing this earlier? And the answer is yes, we should be doing this earlier. And also we have a responsibility to do it in higher education. And this is actually, Joan, this is from a report from ATSA, but I really appreciated this quote from, this is a report that talks about the responsibility of higher education to engage with sexual misconduct and specifically to do interventions with perpetrators and potential perpetrators. And they say it's well documented that the brain continues to develop throughout these years and that many individuals within traditionally aged college student groups are still learning to better understand social cues, control impulses, develop problem solving and moral reasoning, and negotiate mature sexual relationships. This is also similar to what the authors of the book Sexual Citizens argue, that we do have a responsibility because yes, it's important to talk with younger folks about healthy sexual behaviors, but they're not done when they come to us at college. So it's important to continue the work. I want to go over a little bit about research and sort of what we know about patterns of perpetration on college campuses. So here are the 4 areas that I'm going to go through today. And I just think it's important to note that the parameters for the synthesis of research that I'm going over today was specifically research that focuses on college students in the US. So there's a lot of research out there about perpetration, but a lot of it focuses on incarcerated populations because those are people that are easier to access when it comes to talking about perpetration. And that, as we know, is likely a different population than college students. Unfortunately, most college students who are causing harm don't get held accountable in any way. And so we know that they're not the populations that are being studied when folks are studying incarcerated people. So the articles I'm going to go over today are specifically research that focuses on college students, and they're in the US. I did look specifically at research published in the last 10 years, and that resulted in me reading about 65 articles about campus perpetration. And these are sort of the themes that I would say came from them. Something to note about these studies is that the vast majority of them are single institution studies with a convenient sample. What that means to our work and our practice is that it's not generalizable research, meaning that it doesn't tell us something about it's not something that we can say, this is true across the board, which no research really does, but some would argue that randomized samples are more likely to be able to do that. These are not randomized samples, they're convenient samples, and yet they still tell us something about the work. Most of the articles are also quantitatively focused, so we have very little research of actually talking with people. So we have lots of information about the breadth of the problem. We have less information about the depth of the problem. The research we have does examine rates, but very few of them are intentional. And I'll talk about that more in a minute about what examining rates mean. And then the other pieces of these research articles, they're typically looking at correlations. So they're trying to better understand what perpetration is correlated with. So ACEs, as some of you probably know, is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey. There's research looking at personality traits and how that correlates with perpetration, rape myth acceptance. So these kinds of things are what most of the research is trying to do. Almost all of the research explicitly focuses on men as perpetrators. And I think this is super complicated because we do know that most perpetration is most people who are engaging in perpetration do identify as men, and specifically as cisgender men. But we also know that that's not exclusively the case. And we also know that focusing on men as perpetrators sometimes contributes to a level of defensiveness. And so for me, there's a tension here of honoring the fact that the reality is most perpetrators are men, but then also recognizing that that's not always the case. And so I try really hard not to use gender in my language when I'm talking about sexual violence and talk about perpetrators and talk about survivors without gendered language. But sometimes that's difficult. The other thing about this research is that it's almost all done using the Sexual Experiences Survey. There's a perpetration version of this. It was originally developed in 1982 and has been revised several times, most recently in 2007. So what did we learn from all of these studies? The first thing is that our language and terminology is inconsistent in this research. So people talk about unwanted sexual contact, unwanted sexual acts. They use the word sexual assault, sexual violence, sexually violent acts, sexual aggression, all sort of interchangeably. And we don't have an agreed upon scholarly definition for any of these words. And so some of the research is sometimes hard to understand exactly what they're talking about because we're not defining our terminology very clearly. The Sexual Experiences Survey, however, it's because it is so consistently used. These are the areas that it measures. And the Sexual Experiences Survey, of course, doesn't ask people, have you ever committed sexual assault? It outlines behaviors and asks people if they've ever engaged in any of these behaviors. And then it also asks about the frequency. And the way this survey gets broken down is that there are items that group together to illustrate whether people have engaged in unwanted sexual contact, whether they've engaged in coercion, whether they've engaged in attempted rape or completed rape. And when the instrument looks at completed rape, it distinguishes it between the two categories of forcible or incapacitated. And of course, incapacitated usually focuses on alcohol and drug abuse. So we have some inconsistent terminology, but then we have some very consistent scales that get used in the literature. A few things that I would think we need to explore as a group. There's a new survey that people are recommending be used, which is called the Sexual Strategies Survey. The author of that the last name is Strang. And then the researchers from Columbia who've done the Big Shift study, they're talking about the concept of ambiguous consent as being something we need to explore with college students. So some things to think about. In terms of rates and patterns, rates of perpetration it's interesting. So there are no national data on this. Like we do have national data on rates of victimization. And so we have many campus climate studies that are done across the country. So AANU is the one that gets cited the most frequently, but we do know, we have a pretty good sense of rates of perpetration. And when I say rates, what I'm talking about is people who have reported that they've engaged in or things have happened to them. That is different than reports, right? So reports mean something happened to me and I go and tell an authority figure of some some kind and that gets counted, those numbers are extremely low. Rates come from doing surveys with numbers of people that ask about behaviors. And so we have reason to believe that our research on rates of both victimization, well, especially victimization and somewhat perpetration, are relatively accurate because we're not asking for reports and we're not asking specifically, have you been sexually assaulted or have you experienced violence in a romantic partnership? We're asking about behaviors. The challenge with this is that for perpetration, because we do not have national data on college students and perpetration, the ranges are dramatic. So it's anywhere from, in most studies, they say anywhere from 12 to 30% of participants have engaged in some sort of behavior that meets the definition of sexual assault or sexual coercion. So that's a pretty large range. So that's something that we need to know. The other thing that's interesting about the patterns is that there's some research, emerging research that's looking at trajectories. So this idea of desisters, persisters, and initiators. So desisters means that these are people who have, and again, this research unfortunately is all done on men. So the desisters are men who engaged in relationship and sexual violence before they came to college, and have reduced or are no longer engaging. So these are studies that are done longitudinally. Persisters are men who engage in violent behavior consistently, so both before college and during college. And then initiators are people who start engaging in violent behavior during college. And what's interesting about this is there are some clear differences. So desisters are the groups of people who are most commonly associated with high ACEs scores. So remember, I was talking about the adverse childhood experiences. Those people, those men are, if they're engaging in sexual violence, they're doing it before college. And then when they get to college and get out of that environment that they grew up in, they're less likely to keep engaging in it. Whereas initiators, so people who start engaging in violent behavior in college, those are people who are typically associated and heavily influenced by peer culture that contribute to assumptions and social norms around how much sex their peers are engaging in and how much pressure they feel to perform primarily for their peers. So I think there's some fascinating stuff here that has really significant implications for our work. I'll share this with you all later. I so super nerded out about this, but these are all the articles that give some sort of a rate of perpetration. And I just went through and pulled the rates and then you put in quotes the language that they use so we could sort of take a look at different ways that different researchers were talking about this, but we can look at that in more detail later. This is work from Antonia Abbey, who is someone who's been studying perpetration specifically among college students for a very long time. And I just appreciated the ways that she frames some of these pieces. So one of the things that she argues is that young men with little sexual experience who are highly motivated to have sex with many women have a particularly different time recognizing the line between seduction and coercion. And this was really helpful for me to think about. And I appreciate that she goes on to say, this in no way excuses their behavior, but it does, basically what she's saying is it does give us more information on how to intervene. And she said that these behaviors may diminish over time as these men start to focus their energies on forming mutually satisfying relationships with women rather than impressing other men. So that's something for us to consider, I think, as we move forward. These authors of this article also argue young men often feel tension between masculinity and relationship development goals and feel pressured to demonstrate their sexual prowess to their male group. And then finally, my screen is covered. Our article talks about men who commit sexual assault in adolescence or young adulthood, but then stop, are likely to have done so as a part of larger pattern of acting out and sexual experimentation that diminishes with time. So lots and lots of implications here for our work. Okay, last section, risk and protective factors. So if we look at the national data about risk and protective factors, so the CDC has done work around this topic for decades. And they have identified specific risk factors and protective factors for both perpetrators and victimization. And what's interesting to me is if you look at the literature just about college students, these risk factors actually look a little bit different. And you won't be surprised by this because most of you work with college students. But the risk factors for college students are that peer culture piece that we've already talked about, the risk-taking and experimentation behaviors, hostile masculinity, experiencing violence growing up, that's consistent with the CDC pieces as well. Sexual compulsivity, anger, or superficial charm, entitlement, and then subscription to sexual scripts, or kind of an understanding of how one is supposed to behave in sexual relationships. Protective factors, empathy shows up as a huge one, which is not surprising. In fact, there's a study that was done that demonstrates that even if men have a high high subscription to things like hostile masculinity and other things, if they also have high empathy scores, they're not any more likely to commit violence. Those empathy scores sort of mitigate the high scores on hostility to or hostile masculinity and these other pieces. So that's a pretty significant one. And then diverse social networks. So if they interact with more people who are different from them, they're less likely to engage in perpetration. I'll talk about this at a different, so here are 4 more areas that I think we need to explore, or I need to explore, depending on how we move forward. But there's some literature emerging on justifications for assault, which I think could be informative to our work. So it's talking with perpetrators or observing. This study in particular was done on Reddit. There was a whole thread of people who had been who had basically admitted to committing sexual assault, talking about why they did it, and the researchers looked at their justifications. And so I think that's informative. I do think we need to dig a little bit more into the literature on sexual scripts and consent. I think that can be informative. And then there's some research about educational resistance specifically for men students. And I think this can be helpful for us in thinking about how we reach out to and engage students. So that's the end of sort of the overview of the literature that I hope is helpful for us in moving forward and thinking about how we want to do this work. So what I was hoping we could do at this point, you can tell I'm a teacher, right, is to just very briefly move into small groups and just talk about reactions for about 10 minutes and then come back together and talk about how we see this us potentially moving forward. So I'm going to put back up here on the screen. Did I ever stop sharing? No, I did stop sharing. I'm going to put back up here on the screen some discussion questions for you to think about in these small groups. So first, I think just major takeaways. What do you think about what I just shared? Then what are some of the things that are missing? So think about the research piece of it. What do we still need to know? What's missing? How do we go about finding it out? And then practice. So what does this mean for our programming? Now, clearly this is not a comprehensive, it's not everything we've ever known. There are lots of people in this space who've done work around this area also. And so you likely have other things you would say to contribute. But let's just start with these questions and then we'll come back and do a large group discussion about all of it. You might notice a wardrobe change. I forgot to start the recording again after the small group discussions yesterday. And so I wanted to just do a real quick overview of the 3 working groups that we intend to have and how we plan to move forward. So based on the discussion in our group yesterday from the folks who are able to attend, we talked about some of the high points and the takeaways from the research that I shared with the group. And then I went over, these are the 3 areas that we really would like to engage in the next couple of years. So the first one is we do want a working group or a group of people who are interested in specifically exploring patterns of perpetration through a research project. We intend to do a mixed method study of some sort. As you can tell, I've been reading about this topic and there are other people involved with this working group who have have this as an area of interest. There's lots of guidance out there, almost to the point where it's almost a little bit overwhelming to think about what we want to do. But I think it would be really productive for a group of people interested in better understanding perpetration on college and university campuses to come together and talk about what are the things we still need to know, and how do we go about getting that information. So if you're interested in that one, that's what that will be. We'll provide readings and that sort of thing, but we just need people who have ideas and interest. You don't have to have previous experience with research. We can definitely learn those pieces together. If you're involved with data collection or analysis, however, you will need to have IRB training, which I can also walk you through how to do that. The second group we're interested in having is a group that really digs into the piece around perpetrator and potential perpetrator interventions. So certainly there already exists some programs that are specifically dedicated to intervening with students who are found responsible through campus conduct processes. So someone in this meeting earlier mentioned the STARSA program. That's an example of one. And so we know that those pieces exist. One of the things we'd like to create, however, is something for people who are coming to understand that they may have caused harm. We're really hoping to create a culture shift on campus to make it less shameful for people to actually reflect on and think about their own behaviors and how they may be causing harm to people and not even know it. I understand that this is a very big task, and quite frankly, the one that I get the most resistance to, because people are like, how in the world are you ever going to do that? And the answer is, I have no idea. But I also believe that if a group of people come together and think about it and talk about it, we can come up with something. And then the last group that we're looking to talk with, so this is another one of those challenging pieces. So the language around a group for engaging men. We've gone back and forth several times about what to call this, because it's more about masculinity than it is about men. And then also, we don't want to imply that no one else perpetrates harm or violence other than men. And also, there is a dire need for men to come together and understand their role in this issue. And specifically, as you saw in the research I presented, a huge factor that contributes to reducing rates of violence is for men to be in community and have empathy and have diverse networks. And so if we can figure out ways to cultivate that and sort of reduce some of the risk factors, which are the pieces around men believing that their peers are having lots of sex and they have a lot of pressure to engage in lots of sex. So if we can sort of interrupt some of that culture, that's what we hope to do. And so that's what that third working group is. As Brittany mentioned in the meeting, Brittany's office did get permission and funding to hire a coordinator to work on this project on campus. So this working group will really be coming together to brainstorm ideas, potentially implement some of those ideas, and really support what the person who comes into this role. And hopefully we could have some things started before they even get here, so that they don't feel like they're starting with nothing. So those are the three working groups we'd like to see come out of this overarching goal number 4 of our strategic plan, which is to address perpetration. Next steps are going to vary. We are going to ask you all to choose one of these working groups to start, just because we think it'll be easier. Well, actually, we have a lot of people interested in these 3, which is awesome. So part of it's people management, like the number of people involved. So we'd like folks to choose one that they think they're most interested in, and then we'll organize from there. There'll probably be some readings that we ask folks to do. We'll certainly be meeting, depending on the group. I can see those meetings fluctuating. I can see them being once a month. I can see the research one being twice a month, because I think that's the project we need to get started very, very quickly, because I think it will inform the other parts of the working groups. Another suggestion would be to connect with someone that was here today that you didn't know before, just to talk more about what did you take from this? What are you learning? What are you thinking about? Like I've said before, I think it's really important that we have people who are genuinely interested, which doesn't necessarily mean that you're sort of a traditional expert around the topic. But sometimes when we get a bunch of experts in a room, we miss things because we're just so deep into one little piece of it that we're not paying attention to the big picture. So just talking about ideas is really important. And then Mary Jo Dalton is a student staff member in the Center for Violence Prevention, and she's the student staff person who's going to be coordinating our meeting times and sending those things out. So you can watch for an email from her. I just wanted you to know who that was, and so if you saw the name in your inbox, you would know what it is related to. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have, either one-on-one, or you can send me an email. We can jump on a Zoom call. But thank you so much for your interest in this topic. I'm very excited about the direction that we're headed and the number of people who are interested. And I look forward to connecting with you all soon to continue addressing this problem.